But I made a mistake last time where it was out of context, but I said Plato doesn't discuss happiness. I just want to correct a couple of things from last time. He does discuss happiness. He definitely does, and we'll get to that. And the word is eudaimonia, which is Greek for good spirit or well, happy spirit. And it's the same root as euphemism or eulogy. Is good or well. Anyway, he does speak of that, and we're going to talk about it in the Republic. And he also talks about what it isn't in the Philebus. We may mention that as well. So I misspoke, and I didn't want to give the wrong impression. Another thing I wanted to follow up on was a couple of criticisms of the dialogue last time, which was one of them was from Meredith. It was about how the dialogue, Plato was trying to, or Socrates was trying to get a black and white answer. Well, now, and then she compared the court system, which she thinks, is good at adjudicating things which aren't necessarily black and white, right? But see, we're not talking about his guilt or innocence. We're talking about the actual law that he has violated, and the laws are pretty clear. I mean, if you're going to accuse or indict somebody for breaking a law, you can't just say, "Well, I got bad vibes from him." You have to specifically say what law he violated, and that's what Socrates is asking. And so he's been accused of impiety, and he's asking Euthyphro, well, what is piety? I mean, what did I fail to do that was pious? And I think that's a legitimate conversation to have, even now.
Yeah.
So I don't see that that's ridiculous to try to get a black and white idea of the law that I'm violating. I think is a legitimate query. And secondly, of course, the juries don't always get things right. And what Plato wants to know is what is the ideal thing? If you're talking about piety, and this is a Platonic point that's going to go through the history of philosophy. If I have a word, let's say the word piety, does it or does it not refer to something real? And of course, then you have to define what real is. But the point is that how can we be using a word that has no meaning, that people don't understand? It must mean something. It must have a meaning, or else it wouldn't communicate anything. And this is actually not really cleverly addressed until the 20th century with Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein isn't the be all and end all, but he made some very clever observations about how we use language. Anyway, we'll maybe get back to that. So that was what I wanted to say in response to Meredith. And then secondly, there was a...
Wait, no, wait a minute.
Okay.
That's in response to me telling you that we don't have a definition of what is pious or impious. And so it's hard for me to understand how the people at the time were using the words so that I know what they were communicating to one another.
Well, that's exactly what Socrates is asking, though. That's what the dialogue is about. He's asking, what do we mean by that? And so that's the discussion. So in other words, I'm agreeing with you. We don't have a definition. And so now we're going to talk about it. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying that that's what the dialogue is about. He's not looking, he's looking for a clear answer because a crime has been committed or he's been accused of a crime. Well, what is the crime? I think that's a legitimate thing for him to ask. He needs to know because he may be severely punished for breaking this law, and he needs to understand to defend himself what exactly piety is. Then there was a...
Tony, I had one thought on this question of impiety. I was thinking about Socrates since our last meeting. And it occurs to me that, and maybe you mentioned this, I don't know, but this thing about Socrates having this demon, this voice that spoke to him, that basically dictated his actions going forward. Seems to me that that's a pretty good case for impiety right there, because he's listening to an internal voice instead of the edicts of the gods or whoever. Isn't that a legitimate claim for impiety?
That was the claim.
Okay.
That was the claim, that he was listening to a God that wasn't one of the legitimate gods. So that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And just
Tony, for a
yeah.
little bit of a spoiler alert, is Socrates ever going to believe a word has meaning? I mean, it's almost like he is always going to come up with, well, we really can't define this.
Well, okay, let me get back to that. That's a very, very
Okay.
good question, but let me get back to it. I just wanted to follow up, Barry, on the demon. Remember, the demon only tells him what not to do. The demon never tells him what to do. And he says that on the way to give his arguments before the jury in the apology, the demon didn't tell him not to go and not to give his argument. So we're to conclude from that there was nothing unrighteous about the argument he made. And then the other question we had, it might have been Neil, I'm not really sure, I don't remember, but it was a question about cat and mouse. Do we remember, who was that said cat? It was like a cat and mouse game.
I said that.
That was Gerald. Okay. This raises the issue that Plato makes a distinction Socrates makes a distinction between heuristic and dialectic arguments. In an heuristic argument, the objective is to defeat the opponent. So you might compare it to an argument at court, where the defense and prosecution are set off against one another, and the objective is to win. And it's called heuristic after the goddess Eris, who's the goddess of strife. Socrates wants to say that isn't the kind of argument he's interested. He's interested in a dialectic, which is people talking, trying to sort out the truth. And Socrates says that if I get defeated in that argument, I've been done a favor by the person who defeated me, because I've clarified something that I was wrong about. So I'm grateful when I get defeated in an argument. I'm not angry. So those two types of arguments I think it's an important distinction to make. When you're not trying to beat the other guy, you're trying to sort out what the truth is. That's the essential Socratic type of argument. Now, to finish up on the Euthyphro, just to review, Socrates, they meet on the steps. Socrates says, "Can you tell me what piety is?" And Euthyphro says, "No problem. It's what I'm doing. It's what I'm doing right now." And Socrates says, "Well, that won't do. I can't go into court and tell him what Euthyphro is doing. That's no defense for me. So you need a better definition." He says, "What is loved by the gods?" And Socrates says, "Well, the gods don't agree. So what if one god says one thing and one god says, and which happens? The gods don't agree." So then Socrates says, for the sake of argument, let's just assume they all agree, which actually never happens among the Olympian gods, but let's just assume it does happen. And so they're of one voice. And then he raises the question of, well, is the thing made good because God likes it or loves it, or is it independently good and therefore God loves it? And this turns out to be not just a sophistic or linguistic argument. It turns out to be an argument about the nature of God and the nature of his powers. And so it's not a minor argument. But anyway, they can't really answer that. So the next couple of things that Euthyphro offers as a definition are basically service to the gods, ministering to the gods, stuff like going to church, contributing to charity, that kind of stuff. And Socrates' argument, this is pretty funny. Socrates' argument is, well, why do the gods need your help to do things? They're the gods, Does God really need you to put $1 in the offering plate? I mean, isn't he all powerful? Isn't he omniscient and omnipotent? Why does he need help from you? And the funny thing is, John Stuart Mill actually answered this many centuries later. He said, Well, the best way to figure this out is God is not omnipotent, and he does need your help. I think that's a pretty funny resolution to that dilemma. But Mill just says, well, he's not omnipotent. He has to have assistance from his believers. Anyway, so then what happens is they come back to the definition of, well, it's what is loved by the gods, and Socrates says, well, wait a minute, we're right back where we started. Now we have to start all over again and see if we can sort this out. And Euthyphro says, sorry, I'm busy. I got a Pilates lesson, and so I got to run. And Socrates, wait a minute. I'm being accused of a crime here. You have to help me out. And so it just ends. And so what we call this in the tradition is you have a request for a definition of whatever it is, courage, justice, temperance, whatever. And the other person gives a definition willingly. In this case, what I'm doing is pious, is what he says. Then there's something called the elenchus, Elenchus, the elenchus. That just means the examination or refutation. And that's what happens for the dialogue. And the conclusion is called aporia, Aporia, aporia. And that means basically ignorance. And it means the end result is we don't know. And however, it's not the same not knowing that we had at the beginning of the discussion, because now our ignorance is notched up a couple, because we know that won't work and that won't work and that won't work. So we're ignorant in a different way than we were when we started the dialogue. So that's a basic format for the standard or classical Socratic argument. That's how the dialogues go. At the beginning, when Plato gets older, he has different constructions, but that's the beginning, and we think that's the main Socratic kind of formula. I don't know if this is worth saying, but I have
before you go to the next thing you say, can you tell me why this is an example of a Socratic dialogue between Socrates and someone who believes in Socrates having answers to things, right? I'm assuming that Euthyphro is a follower of Socrates, or is that not the case?
No, he's a guy who is prosecuting his father for murder.
Right, I remember that.
Yeah, and Socrates doesn't know him. He's not one of Socrates' followers. Socrates doesn't know him, and he hears about his case and goes, "That's crazy. How you must know what you're doing."
But Socrates needs an answer to his question about what is impious in order to construct a defense in his own case, and that's why he's asking this of Euthyphro. But it ends with no answer.
It does. All of that is correct.
That's a Socratic method.
Well, this is why people very often, and myself included, you read Plato and you go, what the hell? I mean, I was reading this and I see that Euthyphro is always wrong, and okay, that doesn't work. I expect at the end, the denouement is Socrates is going to give us the answer. And yet what happens is nothing. And so you go, why did I read that? That was a waste of time. This is a very standard reaction to reading a Platonic dialogue. And you go, man, this guy's so famous. He's Plato. And what am I left with? There was a waste of time. I'm going to go watch, Beavis and Butthead or something. I can't see what I've accomplished by reading this dialogue. That is a standard reaction to Plato, and it was my reaction. But there is something here, and I was just there is a couple of metaphors for this process. And I'm very fond of them, but I don't expect you to have the same experience. But this happened to me over a period of, say, 15 years. And it is the same structure as a Socratic dialogue, which is you imagine yourself lost in the woods and you try to find a way out and you go down one path. Did I tell you this before? You go down one path for a while and it doesn't lead any place. And then you go back to where you were and try another path. And it also doesn't get you out of the woods. And then you try another path and it's pretty difficult and gnarly, and it also doesn't get you out of the woods. And you do this about a dozen times. And then what happens eventually is the woods disappears. And it's kind of a Zen story. Wittgenstein uses the philosophy leads the fly out of the fly bottle. And what he's saying there is that you can see the outside world, but you're entrapped by your own ideas of what things are. And philosophy leads the fly out of the fly bottle. It doesn't lead you to someplace, it leaves you out of the place you were. And so this is what aporia is, I believe. This is what Socrates means by aporia. And when he says, remember the Oracle at Delphi says, no one is wiser than Socrates. Socrates goes, I don't know anything. But then he realizes what he knows is that he doesn't know. In other words, he's tried all these paths and he knows they don't work. And so if that's wisdom, that's what he has. And so to that degree, he's willing to agree with the Oracle at Delphi. So this is the Euthyphro, and we're going to listen. How many of you, if any, have read the Meno, M-E-N-O, the Meno? Okay, Peter, Bill, quite a few of you.
Okay, do I get half credit?
I don't know.
I'll go for half credit also.
I am kind of sorry. I usually don't assign that, but I think I told you even before the class started. I usually don't assign it until we've actually discussed it, and there's a reason for that. But I do want to. We'll continue on with the Meno. Okay, the Euthyphro, I consider. I think I said the first piece of theology in Western literature, even though it's not about the Christian God and it's not about a singular God. What it does is try to take the stories of religion, because whatever religious text you're reading, it's rituals or prayers or stories. It's not philosophical debates, except sometimes there's a little debate, like Jesus goes into the temple, and there's kind of but it's not really a serious debate. That doesn't happen. And so what you're doing is subjecting these stories and these parables and these prayers to Greek logic, the logic of that doesn't make sense, kind of logic. And you don't see that in religious texts. And so that's why I say the Euthyphro, even though it isn't a Christian or monotheistic document, is addressed like that. You never hear somebody in the Euthyphro saying, quoting scripture or something. That's not what happens. You take the idea and you say, does this make sense? And Socrates is saying, well, it doesn't quite make sense, right? So that's what's going on. And I don't think there's an earlier example of it in Western literature. And that's what all the theologians are going to be doing. When we get to Augustine and Aquinas, we'll show you some great examples, classic examples of theologians trying to sort out apparent logical problems with a theological point. All right. Now, when we get to Euthyphro, it's also a key document in the beginning of Western philosophy. And let's just talk about what that is. When we get to the Meno, what this is Socrates is at the house of Meno. Meno is a rich young guy who later, we don't see this in the dialogue, but people reading the dialogue would know who Meno was, as opposed to Euthyphro. So Meno was a rich guy who was later a general, and uh, I believe he eventually joined the Persian army and then came to a bad end. I think that's what happened to him. He was eventually executed by the Persians, I think, but after he had defected to Persia, I think, something like that. But the people reading this would have known that Meno was a real guy. So anyway, Socrates is at his house. And the question that is before them is, can virtue be taught? Well, virtue is something that's taught by all the sophists. So this is a typical lesson the sophists give. Now, virtue isn't necessarily what we would think of as virtue. And we'll get to this as we go into ethics a little later. But virtue is the 5 Greek virtues were temperance, courage, piety, wisdom, and justice. And that list isn't consistent, but it's usually always temperance, courage, justice, and wisdom, sometimes piety. And actually, Plato sometimes adds beauty to the list, which is really interesting. But virtue doesn't mean like being empathetic or nice or generous or anything like that. That's not what the Greek, it's not that the Greeks weren't any of those things, but the 5 Greeks that, 5 virtues that they honored were basically how to be a full human being. It was more like that than how to properly discharge your obligations to your other human beings. It was how to live a full life. And this is called virtue ethics. When somebody is recommending this is how to live the best life, that's what they're doing, is they're telling you what we call virtue ethics, as opposed to what your obligations are. That's a different kind of different segment of ethics. So this is what the sophists taught, was virtue ethics. And so Socrates wants to know whether it can be taught. And so this goes to the core of whether the sophists are doing anything except scamming you. And by the way, the sophists all took money from you, which Socrates didn't. And the reason he didn't take money from you is that he didn't know anything, and he could hardly sell you something if he didn't have it in his possession. So he didn't charge you for his whatever he said. He didn't, I don't have anything, so I can't very well charge you for what I don't have, right? And so he's kind of really sticking it to the sophists in this dialogue. So, okay, so the question is, can virtue be taught? And so, of course, Socrates says, well, first of all, what is it? Before we answer whether it can be taught or not, can you tell me what it is? And he's talking to Meno, and Meno says, well, and Meno lists some other virtue, well, there's the kind of virtue you have if you're a woman, or if you're a soldier, or if you're a blacksmith or something. Each role in life has its own virtue. And Socrates says, well, it's one word. There must be something continuous or common between all the uses of the word that you're mentioning. So that's what I need, is the general meaning of the word virtue. And of course, then we're essentially down the same path we were with Euthyphro, trying to define what virtue is, right? And this turns out to be not so easy. And we're going to come to a place where Meno says, well, you can't really inquire into anything, can you? Because if you know it, you can't inquire into it. And if you don't know it, you won't recognize it when you see it. This is called Meno's paradox. And then Socrates rephrases it. And this is one of the great paradoxes in all of philosophy, Meno's paradox. And it's this kind of thing. If I tell you to go out in the parking lot and identify a Lamborghini, you won't be able to do it if you don't know that a Lamborghini is a car and not an octopus or a leopard, or an axe. You have to know what it is in order to be able to find it in the parking lot, right? Well, Socrates says the same thing is true about virtue. How would you know what virtue is? How would you be able to recognize it unless you already knew what it was? That's a damn good question. And it is very applicable to, like, I imagine there are people in your life, in your experience, that you thought were virtuous. How did you know they were virtuous? That's the question. How did you know they were virtuous? Did somebody tell you and you just believed them? Or did you mark off a certain checklist of things that they did? How did you determine they were virtuous? But no doubt you've met people you thought were virtuous. So how did you know that? That's the question Socrates wants to ask. All right. So then, right in the middle of this dilemma, Socrates asks Meno to bring out his slave boy. And this is a young boy, and the reason he's chosen is because he grew up in Meno's house, and so Meno knows very well that he's never had any course in geometry because he's known him since he was born, right? So he's a novice, not even a novice when it comes to geometry. And then Socrates presents him with this problem. This slave boy presents him with the problem, which this is why I don't assign people to read the dialogue before I do this, because for 30 years in class, I would present the class with this problem before they'd read the dialogue. So you draw a square on the board and you say, just like Socrates did, you say, what we want to do is double the size of this square. So how do we do it? This is the problem I present to the class. I just draw a square on the blackboard and say, tell me how we're going to double the size of it. And there's some murmuring and stuff. And I say, by the way, if you ever seen this problem before, which is unlikely, because even if you had geometry, this particular problem is probably not one you had. But if you've seen it before, just keep your mouth shut. Let's try to figure it out as a group here. And so somebody eventually, they'll do exactly what happens in the dialogue. I've done this, I don't know, at least 100 times. That's not an exaggeration. 100 times in class. It has always had exactly the same result. Somebody will say, well, you just double the sides and it'll be twice the size. And you go, well, that's 4 times the size. That's not going to work. And so they'll say, okay, 1.5 times the size. Well, that's not right either. That's not going to work either. And they just kind of guess. And then somebody in the class will say, what if you draw a diagonal across 2 corners and then you use that as the side of your new square? Then you will have, instead of 2 triangles, you'll have 4, and they'll be exactly double the size of the original. And somebody will come up with that, and then the class will go, oh yeah, obviously I didn't think of that. Now, there are 2 things that happened there that have puzzled philosophy ever since and are still puzzling philosophy, and I'll get to them in a minute. One is, well, they're both related. One is, how did that happen that you knew that would be a solution to that geometry problem? Where did you get that information? Now, Socrates, what he does, some people criticize the dialogue, and I don't know how you felt about it. Did you feel that Socrates was kind of leading the witness and kind of prompting the boy to give the right answer when you read it?
I felt that, and I also didn't understand why he called it a recollection.
Okay, we're going to get to that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No.
Yeah. But because of the boy didn't. He knew what he knew, but he'd never examined this question. He didn't know. This is not a problem he never had thought about. So he had to be led, right? I mean, I thought he had to be led.
Okay,
Well,
well, this has been
Socrates leads him, but he doesn't tell him what to do. You know, the main thing he does is draw the squares in the sand, and the boy figures out a lot of it for himself, you know, in answer to fairly leading questions, but not an answer to orders. So it's impressive to me how
Me
much
too.
the boy figures out on his own.
But Tony, I have a question. Does it matter that the new shapes are triangles rather than a square?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, if you're okay, you have a big old square and you're drawing diagonals.
Yeah, no,
And the
one
triangle.
diagonal. Yeah, I
You
go
know,
ahead.
triangles. So he says double the size of the square. Okay. So you think you're doubling it and you ended up 4 times as big, right? Then you draw an X like this. You've got 4 triangles rather than squares.
Yeah, but if you draw the lines from the midpoint of each side of the bigger square, then what you get is a square kind of in diamond pattern inscribed in the middle of the bigger square.
Let me show you.
Yeah. If you go from the midpoints, you will get a square on in a diamond shape, sort of.
Right. So let me. You see this?
Yeah.
Because that's the original square, and this is the way I do it in class, by the way, because Socrates, we don't actually know how he drew it, but we assume everybody's always assumed he draws it in the sand, in the dirt, right? So it's no better than mine is, right? And so this is one of the first guesses. This is when the sides are 1.5 times the original, and that's not correct. And so this is the solution. So Anne, I don't know if this answered your.
Oh,
So this, you can see that this is
yeah.
4 times. So there's 4 triangles instead of 2, and they're all the same size. So that must be double the size, right?
but I'm just asking if it matters that they don't have the shape of a
Well,
square.
this does have the shape
Give
of
it,
a
where'd you
square
get this extra thing?
See, yeah, this has the shape of a square.
to draw.
This larger square here.
Okay, whatever.
There's a simpler solution. If you start from the midpoint of each side of the square, you end up with a square inscribed in the larger square.
Yeah, there's different solutions, but this is the one that I think Socrates gives us. So anyway,
Thanks.
the question is, how did the boy know this? And one of the criticisms that I just mentioned is that this has been debated, of course, for 2,000 years. So it's been this is well trodden territory. One of the criticisms is Socrates really is tipping his hand. He's telling the boy what it is in subtle ways, subtle hints. He's giving him hints, but actually it doesn't matter, because sometime in history there was a time before this problem had been solved. Like, we assume that it hadn't been solved by Homo erectus, or even, let's go back further, the dinosaurs probably hadn't solved this problem. At some point in history it was solved. How was it solved? We're going to assume it was human beings that solved it, just for the sake of argument. It probably was. Actually, I think it'd be really funny if you could communicate this to a chimpanzee. If you could communicate what the problem was, whether the chimpanzee could solve it. That is a very interesting question. But anyway, the human being, someplace along the line, solved the problem. So one thing you want to ask yourself is, where was the solution to the problem before the human being figured it out? Did it always exist, or is this something that human beings created? Like, obviously human beings created, I saw her standing there by the Beatles, but did they create this proof, or this geometric relationship?
Isn't posing the problem maybe more important than solving it?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that. It's an interesting, different angle, but it was solved.
Well, but isn't the reason it was solved because it had a practical aspect to, in other words, I didn't feel like I had to solve this until I had the problem. This, for some reason, I needed to know the answer to that problem.
Well, I would say you never need to know the answer to this problem in the way that it's given to you, because as a practical thing, see, the Egyptians knew, for example, the Pythagorean theorem, but they never bothered to prove it because they didn't think it was necessary. It was a practical solution, and the same is this is a practical thing. But I'm not sure why this problem would present itself in absolute accuracy. The thing about the solution is that this isn't even a thousandth of a millimeter off. It's an exactly perfect solution to the problem. And this is, it's not just good enough to be a solution, it is absolutely perfect. And you know it's absolutely perfect just by looking at it. So I think it's beyond just a practical use. You could,
I would say it's a very insightful solution to the problem. And the truth of that is eternal, but the insight was created by a person.
Well, yeah, that's right. Somebody figured it out. And the question for all of philosophy since then is, how did that happen, that somebody figured it out? What's your explanation for that? You've got this meat computer, that we inherited from worms and whatever, gophers and dinosaurs, and then we got this slab of protoplasm in our head, and all of a sudden it comes out with this perfect geometric solution, and that is a puzzle, and it has puzzled human beings ever since this problem was presented by Plato. Now, one of the things is, where did it come from, and how did the guy recognize it, the slave boy? And the second puzzle is, why does everybody immediately know that's the right answer? All of you guys, as soon as you saw it, you went, yeah, that's an answer. But imagine a different kind of knowledge. Like, imagine that I was asking you what the capital of Arkansas was. Well, some people would remember it and some people wouldn't. And if somebody said it's Des Moines, some people wouldn't know whether that was right or not. But you all know this is exactly right. And it's like, geez, it's like we're the Borg or something. We all know this. I don't know if that's a Star Trek reference, but the Borg were a species of interplanetary beings who were all wired together, basically. So why do we all recognize immediately that this is the correct answer? Because in different kinds of the kind of knowledge that you learn, like Des Moines, like the capital of Arkansas, like Little Rock, those things aren't learned by everyone. And I have to assume that not everyone here took a geometry class where they studied this. So they're not recalling it from a class they took. So the question Socrates asks is, well, how do they know it then? Now, Socrates is going to, dang, I didn't get this out. Sorry. Give me a second.
Would you go back to the demonstration again? Because I'm feeling dumb here, that it's not apparent to me at all.
Okay. Just a minute. Let me get this up here. I'm sorry about this, but well, let's just answer your question first, and then I'll go back to this. What's the question? You want to see the drawing again?
Yeah.
Okay.
And when we say we want to double the square. We want to double the area of the
You're right,
square.
right. So there it is. That's the solution.
Where's the original square?
Let me see if I can do that. There.
There's the square.
Mhm.
Now, show us how we double it. Its
Okay.
area.
This is the first guess. Just make the sides 1.5 times as long. Actually, that's the second guess. And the third guess is this, that we draw a diagonal from 2 corners of the square and then create a new square with that as the base or one of the sides. So it's going to be
And I
4
think the
triangles.
point, I think the point here, Tony, is you can take half of that upper left-hand square, which is a triangle, and all of a sudden you see 4 of those in the tilted square. And so you can actually count that area becoming doubled.
Right,
And from 2 triangles to 4 triangles.
right.
And 4 is clearly twice as big as 2. And it's that insight that working with triangles instead of little squares, the sort of translate it to triangles, and you've gone from 2 triangles to 4 triangles, and the slave knew that 4 is twice as big as 2.
Okay, so the original square is the upper left of this
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, right.
Okay, that was the thing that was not clear to me. So now it's clear to me. I get it.
Okay.
And the thing that is intuitive is that it goes from 2 triangles to 4 triangles
Right.
rather than trying to make squares. And that's kind of the insight, is the insight that the way to transform the square visually is to think of it as comprised of triangles instead of little squares.
Right, right.
And then you can put the triangles together. And
Yeah.
that kind of geometric insight is that 4 is twice as big as 2 is sort of the key thing. But how do you make the square into 2 things that are easy to turn into 4 things is the picture version. And
Right.
where did that idea come from? Does that make any sense, Tony?
Yes, exactly. So
You have to know that 4 is twice as much as 2, though.
Yeah.
that's right. And this is some people will say, well, it's the square root of 2 is the right answer for the new side, but that we're not going to go with the Greeks didn't actually have that quite together yet, because as I said, the Greeks didn't have numbers like we have. They didn't have Arabic numbers. They used letters, and they didn't have a 0 or a decimal point. So a decimal point, in fact, that was a big problem with it really bothered the Greeks that the square root of 2 was an irrational number. It just really stuck in their brain that that's not how the universe should work, is having irrational numbers. Anyway, that's beyond our purview for today. Okay, so the 2 issues that have puzzled people ever since this dialogue. Number one, how did the slave boy know what the intuit, or whatever you want to say? How did he know what the solution was? And secondly, why does everybody else immediately understand it? That's both of those things seem very peculiar, because it seems some kind of universal knowledge that we all share. That and where do we get some kind of universal knowledge? Where do we get that? Now,
So Tony, I don't think the universal knowledge that 4 is twice as big as 2, I think our animal friends know that.
That's why I say it would be very interesting if we could ask a chimpanzee this question.
Well, I don't think they would. I don't know about the triangle part of it, but they would certainly. I think they know that 4 is twice as big as 2.
I'm not sure they know that. That's a good
I've
question.
watched our dogs share things, and if one of them gets 3 and one of them gets 2, they're not happy. But if each one of them gets 2, but the trick that to me is the triangle part of it, and that's kind of a creative thing. But the Greeks were working with triangles. They were trying to fiddle around with trigonometry or geometry. So triangles were something they were thinking in.
Well,
At least
also, I wonder if the dogs actually know that it's double, or whether they just know it's more or less. That
they know what's fair. They know that it's fair that they each get equal shares.
Yeah, I understand that, but they can see that one dog has more than the other, but that's not necessarily that they know it's double.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't necessarily know the relationship between the two numbers.
Tony,
Anyway,
Tony, one thought
yeah,
that comes to mind in this is makes me think about Piaget and his work in how children acquire certain concepts, and the fact that at a certain age, it's just simply not like conservation. They don't understand that four objects close together, are same as four objects further apart. But after a certain stage of their development, suddenly they understand that. So where did that understanding come from? It just seems like an interesting parallel to this question.
absolutely. And I was just going to mention, I don't want to talk forever this morning, but I want to kind of give you a list of how this problem is echoed down through the ages, and it's not something that we can just dismiss as some stupid thing by Plato. As a matter of fact, my colleague over at the College of Marin, he wrote a history of philosophy, and he talks about Plato, and he doesn't mention the doctrine of recollection. I'm going, what the? Anyway, this sounds like one of the dumbest doctrines that you could ever hear, that we just recall things. Like, how could you recall that Socrates? Okay, Socrates is going to quote Pindar, and he's going to. I don't have the quote. Damn it! For some reason, I didn't boot up this quote. But anyway, it's in the Meno, and Socrates says. And this is a typical device used by Plato over and over again. You don't even notice it the first 10 times you read it, but Plato's always doing this. He has Socrates quote Pindar and says, all knowledge is recollection, because the soul has been reborn. And when it was between lives, it learned everything. And now when it's born again, it forgets everything, but it can recollect everything. And all knowledge is connected. Now, this kind of spiritual, mystical part of Plato is easy to dismiss. You go, that is just, come on, who recollects how to operate an iPhone? It didn't even exist like before you were born. You couldn't recollect it. So that's the obvious objection to it, is that we know tons of stuff that we must have learned in this life. But there are things that it doesn't seem like we did learn in this life that we know. And those are the things that Plato is interested in. So the doctrine of recollection seems like one of the dumber things. Plato has two fundamental doctrines, and both of them seem stupid. One is that there's an ideal world. We're going to talk about this more. And the other is we recall this ideal world. I'm sorry, this is a very deep mystery, because how do you recall things that, and unless Plato is right, which of course he's not. I mean, we don't really think that our soul has been reborn, or do we have been reborn many times? And even if it was, it just kind of pushes, it kicks the ball down the block, because when did we learn it the first time? It still doesn't answer when we learned it the first time. Even if we're reincarnated from dogs, when did the dog learn the solution to this problem? So it's a very big conundrum, and it's still with us. And I just want to run real quickly through the history of philosophy and why this is still bugging everyone. First of all, Plato's student, Aristotle, didn't believe this. So just from the get-go, his student thought, no, there isn't any such thing as recollection. We learn everything from our senses, from what he calls particulars. And this will eventually come to fruition with the British empiricists, so Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, you probably learned about. They believe everything comes from the senses. And Locke said that we're born with a tabula rasa. We have a blank slate. And everything we've learned through perception. We didn't know anything. The other school is rationalism, and the guys associated with that are Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. And Aristotle was an empiricist, so he didn't believe Plato. And so this is a big controversy that's been brewing ever since this time. And so then we get to the Middle Ages, and the scholastics are going to say that God put these ideas in our mind, of course, because when you don't have a solution, you just say God did it. We're going to get back to that argument when we talk about Thomas's proofs for the existence of God. Then bring it up to a more modern period. Chomsky has something he calls universal grammar. And I don't, probably most of us know Chomsky from being a political guy, but he actually is a famous linguist. And this is still an intensely fought controversy within linguistics. And that is, the universal grammar idea is that every language, and he comes at this from an empirical study of languages. And he takes all these languages and analyzes them, and he says, well, they all share this structure, which he calls universal grammar. And that's why we can learn other languages, because we already kind of have the structure of what language does in our mind. Whereas, as Wittgenstein points out, if you know what language does, and you also know how it's structured. And Wittgenstein points out that if you point at something, like the most primitive kind of definition is to point at something and say, this is an apple. But Wittgenstein points out, in order for that to make sense, you have to know what the pointing gesture means. And a dog doesn't know that. You probably tried to point something out to a dog, and he just looks at your hand. He doesn't know you're pointing. Anyway, what Chomsky points out is that a child of, say, that starts talking doesn't have enough data to construct the rules of language. In other words, a large language model, what they do in AI? What they do is they have billions and billions of phrases and sentences and words. And you ask it a question, and it goes through all those things. And it also understands the structure of language because it has billions of examples. But a baby, a child of 1 or 2, doesn't have billions of examples. And Chomsky calls this a poverty of data, or equivalent phrase. I paraphrase, but he says a baby doesn't have enough of a sample, which would take billions of samples to figure out exactly what the structures of language always mean. And yet a baby very quickly understands what's going on with the language in a way that you'd have to have a supercomputer if you were just starting from scratch. In other words, you had no inbred or inborn innate understanding of what the structure of language was. You'd have to have a supercomputer to have enough samples to figure it out from scratch. But somehow babies figure it out very quickly. And Chomsky is careful about what he says about biology and how biology could have led to this. But unless you're kind of a spiritual person, you have to believe that somehow our brains evolved a way to represent the universe through language, and that every human being is presented with that structure upon birth or very soon after birth. It can understand what language is doing. Your cat doesn't even understand what you're doing when you make noises. It doesn't understand that there's a verb and a noun and an action intended. It doesn't understand that language is even doing anything like that, but a child does. And it very quickly learns how to use language on its own. So this is just an extension of the argument that Plato makes in the Meno. Where do we get this knowledge from? And this is called this is a term, a Latin term in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. They start using the term a priori and a posteriori. Plato doesn't use these terms; they're Latin, so they're not something Plato would say. Plato would we'll get to this, but he calls it the world. There's a world of forms and a world of ideas, and our mind is able to access the world of ideas, and our senses are able to access the world of perception. So there's those two worlds. He's going to be a dualist, and the things that are in the world of forms are accessed by our brains through recollection. And then the things that we see through the senses are attached or participate in the forms. That's what Plato's going to say. All right, I think I've talked kind of long enough about this, but I just want to indicate that this is the first discussion in history we have of this idea of a priori. Just let me define that. A priori just means before sense experience, prior to sense experience, and a posteriori means after sense experience. So a priori, a posteriori. And this Meno is the first example we have of Plato trying to demonstrate that there is such a thing as a priori knowledge, except he doesn't use that term. Once again, I did that experiment for 30 years and it never came out different. The students always figured it out and everybody always realized it was the right answer, time after time. We like science experiments to be repeatable, and I can guarantee you that's a repeatable experiment. So anyway, there you go. That's enough for today. So any thoughts, comments, remarks, arguments, especially refutations? Alan.
Oh, sorry.
I came across many years ago a case study that was really persuasive about Chomsky's theory of sort of a fundamental structure of language. And it involved a town in Israel that had a high proportion of genetic deafness. I mean, deaf parents were having deaf children, and no one actually began a school to teach a particular sign language, but what they observed was that children would, in their play, communicate with each other through primitive signs, pointing and inventing gestures, and that over a period of 3 generations, a complete language evolved in this village that had a full grammatical structure with past tense and future tense and so on, all signed. They found that the children grew more and more sophisticated over generations, taking the signs of the earlier generation and improving over them, making them more sophisticated, so that they invented a full language in the sense of there was a name for everything. There were verb tenses, there were prepositional phrases, and so on. But it didn't involve speech. But I thought that was really fascinating.
Now, is that something Chomsky analyzed?
I don't think so. I think that I'd have to search around to discover where I read this. I'm not sure I saved it, but
well, it makes sense, and it would confirm his or tend to at least confirm his theory that there's a universal grammar, and they whatever symbols you use, whatever language you use, there's an understanding of verbs and nouns and tenses.
Yeah.
So that would tend to support his theory. I see a couple of comments here in the chat. One is Anne says that she mentions the intimations of immortality, which is my favorite poem by Wordsworth in this context. And then Doug searched for the Pindar reference in Meno. Thank you, Doug. And then Laurel claims that dogs do understand pointing gestures, and she has a Smithsonian argument to back her up.
Well, there's a lot of research actually on this.
Oh, there is.
That quite a lot, that dogs, even from very early stages, begin to understand human pointing, what they understand it as, whether they see it as a command or as information, depends somewhat, and that there is some genetic basis apparently. Some dogs do better at it than others. And interestingly, they are better at it than understanding human gestures, at least, than some other species, even some of the great apes. Apparently chimps aren't quite as good at it.
I thought you were going to say they're better at it than some humans.
That's as may be, but that there's something about the socialization or social interaction between humans and dogs. I would be very interested in knowing whether the foxes, that the Russian foxes, have become humanized or dogized or so civilized, also follow this. But there's clearly brain structures that correspond to things that enable communication. And interestingly, there's been a lot of research on reading and what part of your brain reads language. And the fact that you can read printed words apparently has to do with repurposing some areas of the brain that would normally be used for, or are used in other animals or in humans who don't read, I guess, for recognizing things like animals amongst the trees. And that the alphabet apparently, the reasons that alphabets in general have make use of certain, basic things like straight lines, curves, has to do with the fact that they're repurposing a part of the brain that recognizes patterns that are simple patterns. Anyway, but that language has a lot of ways it reaches us. And that we have the sort of magic thing that happens when you learn to read and you go, all of a sudden, it feels like, from struggling to read words to you look at the page and there's language in your head. So our brains have some very interesting structures that have parallels in other animals and that are repurposed to do things, and to what extent language, the kind of grammar, underlying grammar that Chomsky postulates, is in there. And I would guess that some of the things like recognizing triangles and geometry have something to do with the pieces of your brain, that visual processing, that we're repurposing something that's already there, and in ways that we have the capacity for learning, because pattern recognition in some way is there. So that's speaking as sort of a not very skilled.
No. It's all great stuff, Laurel. It would have to be somehow that it would, in other words, unless we believe God put these capacities in our brain, it has to be that somehow it comes out of organic evolution. And I just want to point out a couple of examples of that from the natural world. One is planaria. If you train a planaria to go through a maze, which you can do apparently, and then you chop it in half, both halves will know how to go through the maze.
Wow.
Or remember. And another example of this is the monarch butterfly flies from Mexico to whatever it is, Nova Scotia, and back. but it doesn't do it in one generation. It does it in
Right.
3 generations. And so how does the third generation know where it's going? So there are mysteries in the animal kingdom that are equally puzzling as the human brain. But of course, Plato knew none of any of this. But the puzzle still is not resolved. The puzzle that he points out is still not answered. So
baby.
let's see. Dewey says, of course, this is all proven by lessons in chemistry. What does that mean?
The book, the popular novel that came out a couple of years ago, that where the woman teaches her dog to learn all about 1,000 words or something like that. I assumed everybody here who is phenomenally literate would have read it.
No, I haven't read it. I didn't know about it, Dewey.
Well, it's very funny. It's a great
Okay.
book.
Yeah.
On the dialectic, I just read Meno for the first time yesterday, and I discovered that famous simile, which I'd known for years, when Meno gets exasperated at Socrates refusing all his definitions of
Yeah.
virtue. And he says, you're like the stingray,
Yeah.
you step on it and it stings you. And Socrates says, yes, I am. I do bewilder people, but what you forget is that I bewilder myself too.
Yeah.
I am not like the stingray in that way, and that my perplexity is the same as your perplexity when I talk to you. And, that seems like a great remark about the dialectical method and, why aporia is so often the only conclusion. Although in the Republic, he does end up not only describing an ideal commonwealth, but giving a definition of justice. It just isn't a very good definition.
Well, we're going to get to that, and it's not quite as clear as all that, Peter. Not quite. Yeah, the aporia thing is kind of like Zen. It's kind of like Taoism. The way that can be spoken of is not the true way. And if you want to make those relationships, you certainly can. I'm not Alan Watts, and I'm not going to try to overdo that. But I also can't speak as mellifluously as Alan Watts. Man, what a voice he had. All right, I think we've kind of covered enough for today, but the Meno is really one of the important, both of these are really important documents in the history of the development of Western intellectual life. And both of them seem silly at first reading. At least they did to me. They just seem, who cares, not important, but they are important. Both of them are important and have echoed down through the age. But there's a guy named Alfred North Whitehead who, with Bertrand Russell, wrote Principia Mathematica. Have you ever read that, Laurel?
I'm sorry, which one? The
Principia Mathematica by Bertrand Russell.
No, little bits of it.
Okay. Anyway, it's a book that intended to reduce mathematics to logic, and it was written by Russell and Whitehead. Anyway, Alfred North Whitehead said Western philosophy or the history of Western philosophy is best understood as a series of footnotes to Plato. And I always thought that was ridiculous, but I no longer think that. Most of the stuff that he said was unbelievably prescient, and most of it that is important is still being dealt with. All right. I guess let's see. We're up to over an hour now. Any other? I don't want to cut it off if somebody has anything else to offer.
So one issue is there's a big leap between the pre-Socratic philosophers who were dwelling on going backwards into explaining the world by sense and observation and so on. And all of a sudden we've leapt to Socrates, and we only get a kind of a side notion. So, so we talk about Pindar. Well, Pindar said, there's somebody says this is how this was, but they don't look like going back to that examination of the world itself. Now they're already at a much more ethereal level. Am I missing something here?
No, first of all, you're right. Neil, what happens is all those guys were just all we have is just fragments of them, as I mentioned. And I think I said like it'd be like an archaeological dig and you saw shards and bones, and then all of a sudden you found an iPhone. That's what we have in Plato. All of a sudden you have this very complex human world and all this other stuff. Now, Plato himself doesn't concentrate too much on the physical world, a little bit in the Timaeus. Aristotle will concentrate on that more, but we won't talk about it too much. The physicists, Democritus and Leucippus were the atomists in Greece, and the Greeks were very good scientists. Eratosthenes and Aristarchus. Eratosthenes figured out how big the world was. I'm going to tell you that story because that's very clever. And then Aristarchus figured out that we orbit the sun doesn't orbit us, and all that stuff was discovered early by the Greeks. Then you have Euclid. So it's not like they forgot science, Neil, but Plato is going to be more interested in the human mind and soul than he is in geology and physics and so forth.
In the Apology, there's a little bit of a transition. Socrates says he studied the physicists, he tried to learn about the nature of the physical world, and eventually he decided that that was not a very important thing to study. He wanted to know how to live. So he decided to move in the direction of philosophy that had to do with how you live.
Peter, do you remember if he mentions Anaxagoras in that context? I don't recall, but Anaxagoras was a Greek who got, like Socrates, he got kind of kicked out of Athens. He didn't get executed, but he got kicked out for the reason that he attributed everything to mechanical, physical forces, what we would call physics, as opposed to the actions of the gods. And this was thought to be somewhat heretical by the Greeks, and it earned him some enmity. I think I'd have to look into it again, but Anaxagoras was another famous guy. I think Socrates certainly knew about him if he didn't know him. I don't remember the dates on those guys. But yeah,
more or less, because Anaxagoras was a friend of Pericles, so he would have been older than Socrates, but probably not that much older.
Maybe not even older. But anyway, the Greek physicists and their explorations of the physical world just kind of ceased during the Christian era. That's why they call it the Dark Ages. We don't have a hell of a lot of science that came out of the Dark Ages, and it didn't pick up again until after the Renaissance and Galileo and so forth. And so it's really well, I don't know if it's a tragedy. It is what it is, as they say. But yeah, the physics, they were brilliant at figuring out physical things, and it was just kind of dropped by the Christians. Anything else? Well, it's a wonderful pleasure to see you guys all meeting with me. And so what we'll do next time, going forward, what the next thing we're going to do is just go a little bit more into the Meno, not much more. And then what I'm going to do is give you an overall view of Plato. And I'll talk about the Republic in that. And then we'll finish up with Diotima's presentation in the Symposium. And then after that, we'll move on to Aristotle. Everything we go over could be a semester of school. So we're just briefly touching on things, and they're all gnarly problems that deserve a lot more attention. But we're old folks. We don't have a million years to do this stuff. We'll just do what we can while we're here. All right. So we'll see you all next on Thursday.
Bye, everybody.
That's
good. Thanks, Tony.
Right.
See ya.
Thanks, Tony.
All right.